Normandie's propulsion system was revolutionary. Instead of conventional marine steam engines, the ship used turboelectric drive. Steam from oil-fired boilers powered turbines. The turbines drove electrical generators. The generators supplied power to electric motors. The motors turned the propellers. This system added complexity and weight. Why choose it? The answer involves efficiency across varying power demands. A conventional marine engine operates most efficiently at one specific speed. Operating faster or slower reduces efficiency significantly. This is problematic for a passenger ship that must frequently change speed for navigation, weather, or other reasons. Electric motors operate efficiently across wide speed ranges. By using turboelectric drive, Normandie could vary speed without excessive fuel consumption. The turbines could operate at their optimal speed continuously, with power demand managed by varying electrical load. The system also provided redundancy. Normandie had 4 turbogenerator sets, each independent. If one failed, the others could continue operating. The ship could maintain propulsion even with significant equipment failure. But the system required extraordinary electrical equipment. The generators were the largest ever installed on a ship, each weighing over 400 tons. The motors were equally massive. The switchgear and control systems occupied entire rooms. The electrical distribution system used cables thick enough to walk on. Managing this system required skilled engineers. They monitored voltages, currents, temperatures, vibrations. They adjusted loads to maintain balance. They performed continuous maintenance to prevent failures. This was intellectual work as much as physical labor. The boiler rooms were hot beyond modern comprehension. 8 massive boilers generated steam at high pressure. Each boiler stood several stories tall and contained hundreds of tubes through which hot gases from oil burners passed, heating water to create steam. Maintaining these boilers required stokers who worked in temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. They wore minimal clothing and drank constantly to avoid dehydration. Their work was monitoring gauges, adjusting fuel flow, maintaining water levels, cleaning ash and soot from tubes. This work was dangerous. A boiler tube could burst, releasing superheated steam that would kill instantly. A fuel line could rupture, spraying burning oil. Water levels could drop, exposing tubes to direct flame and causing catastrophic failure. Constant vigilance was essential. The steam system was complex. Steam from the boilers passed through systems that removed moisture, then through turbines where pressure dropped as energy was extracted, then to condensers where remaining steam was converted back to water, which was then pumped back to the boilers. This closed cycle required precise control of temperatures, pressures, and flow rates throughout. The turbines themselves were precision machinery. Each turbine contained hundreds of blades arranged in stages. Steam entered at high pressure and expanded through successive stages, driving the turbine rotor at thousands of revolutions per minute. The rotor was connected to the generator, converting mechanical rotation to electrical current. Turbine blades operated under extraordinary stress. They experienced high temperatures, high pressures, high rotational forces. They had to be manufactured to precise tolerances and from materials that could withstand these conditions without deforming or cracking. Any imbalance would cause vibration that could destroy the turbine. Regular maintenance required stopping each turbine in rotation, opening it for inspection, checking blade condition, measuring clearances, testing for cracks. This work was performed in port during the 3-day turnaround between voyages. Time was severely limited. Engineers worked rapidly and carefully, knowing that failure to detect a problem could result in catastrophic breakdown at sea. The propulsion motors were equally remarkable. Each motor contained massive electromagnetic coils and rotors weighing tons. When electrical current flowed through the coils, magnetic fields formed, causing the rotors to turn. This rotation was transmitted through reduction gearing to the propeller shafts. The reduction gearing was necessary because electric motors operate efficiently at high speeds, while propellers operate efficiently at low speeds. The The gears reduced rotational speed while increasing torque. This gearing had to transmit tens of thousands of horsepower while operating smoothly enough that passengers felt no vibration. Lubrication was critical throughout the machinery spaces. Moving parts required continuous oil flow to prevent metal-to-metal contact that would cause wear and heat. Normandie's lubrication system contained thousands of liters of oil circulating through pumps, coolers, and filters. Oil quality had to be monitored constantly. Contamination or degradation would cause bearing failures. The cooling systems were equally essential. Machinery generated enormous heat that had to be dissipated. Seawater was pumped through heat exchangers, absorbing heat from oil coolers, from turbine condensers, from other machinery. This heated seawater was then discharged back to the ocean. The cooling system moved thousands of tons of water per hour. Electrical generation had to match consumption exactly. The ship's electrical load varied as passengers used lights, elevators, air conditioning, kitchen equipment. Generators had to respond instantly to load changes. If generation fell below demand, voltage would drop, potentially damaging equipment. If generation exceeded demand, frequency would increase, equally problematic. Automatic control systems managed generation and load continuously. These were mechanical and electrical devices, not electronic computers. They used feedback mechanisms, sensing voltage and frequency deviations, and adjusting turbine speed or electrical connections to maintain stability. These systems were reliable but required monitoring. The ship's electrical distribution system was three-phase alternating current at specific voltage and frequency. This power was distributed through switchboards to various zones of the ship. Each zone had protective devices that would isolate faults without affecting the entire system. Designing this distribution system required balancing reliability, redundancy, and efficiency. Auxiliary systems were numerous. Pumps moved water, fuel oil, and other liquids throughout the ship. Compressors generated compressed air for various purposes. Ventilation fans moved air through hundreds of ducts. Refrigeration equipment kept food storage areas cold. Each system was essential, and each required maintenance and monitoring. The engineers who operated these systems worked 4-hour watches. They stood watch in control rooms, monitoring gauges, recording readings, responding to alarms. Between watches, they performed maintenance, repaired equipment, studied manuals. Their work was continuous throughout the voyage. Chief engineers held significant responsibility. They supervised all machinery operations, managed maintenance schedules, authorized repairs, ensured fuel and supplies were adequate. They reported to the captain but had considerable autonomy over technical matters. Their judgment determined whether the ship could safely operate. Junior engineers learned through experience. They began with simple tasks and gradually assumed more responsibility as they demonstrated competence. This apprenticeship system transmitted knowledge that was not fully documented in manuals. Experienced engineers understood their machinery through long familiarity, knowing how it sounded when operating correctly, detecting problems by subtle changes in noise or vibration. Spare parts were carried for critical components, but some failures could not be repaired at sea. If a major component failed catastrophically, the ship might have to proceed at reduced speed or even require towing to port. This rarely happened, but the possibility existed. Engineers worked to prevent failures through meticulous maintenance. Fuel consumption was monitored closely. At full speed, Normandie burned approximately 1,000 tons of fuel oil per day. This represented significant expense. Engineers were expected to minimize consumption without sacrificing speed. This required understanding which machinery operated most efficiently under which conditions and adjusting operations accordingly. The machinery spaces were noisy beyond modern experience. Turbines screamed, generators hummed, pumps rattled, steam lines hissed. Engineers wore no hearing protection in this era. They communicated by shouting or hand signals. Many suffered hearing loss after years of this work. Heat was equally challenging. The machinery generated enormous thermal energy. Ventilation helped but could not eliminate the heat. Engineers working in these spaces became acclimated but never comfortable. They sweated constantly, drank water frequently, took breaks when possible. The contrast between the machinery spaces and passenger accommodations was absolute. Passengers experienced quiet, comfortable temperatures, smooth operation. They were completely insulated from the industrial reality that made their comfort possible. This insulation was intentional and essential to the illusion of luxury. Engineers understood this contrast. They knew that their hot, noisy, dangerous work enabled passenger comfort. Some resented this disparity. Others took pride in their essential role, most simply accepted it as the nature of shipboard life. The engineering achievement represented by Normandie was extraordinary. The ship's machinery was the most powerful, most complex installation afloat. It operated reliably despite the harsh marine environment, the constant motion, the demanding schedule. This reliability was not accidental. It resulted from excellent design, quality construction, skilled operation, and continuous maintenance. When passengers praised Normandie's beauty, they rarely thought about the machinery. When they appreciated the ship's speed, they did not consider the engineering that made it possible. This invisibility was the highest compliment. The machinery worked so well that it disappeared from consciousness. But the engineers knew what was required. They knew the constant vigilance, the technical skill, the physical endurance. They knew that one mistake, one overlooked detail, one moment of inattention could result in disaster. They carried this knowledge every watch, every voyage. The engineering in motion was never static. It was continuous adjustment, response, adaptation. Conditions changed constantly. Waves, wind, water temperature, power demand, all varied. Engineers had to respond appropriately. The ship moved because they made it move, and kept moving because they kept it moving. This was the hidden dimension of Normandie's brief paradise. Behind the art and luxury was machinery, and behind the machinery were men who understood and managed it. Without them, the ship was merely steel and decoration. With them, it was a living thing, moving across the ocean, carrying thousands of people between continents. Summer 1939 felt provisional. Normandie maintained her regular schedule through June, July, and early August. Passengers boarded in Le Havre, crossed to New York, disembarked, and the ship prepared for the return voyage. Everything appeared normal, but nothing was normal. Conversations aboard ship that summer returned constantly to politics. Would Hitler attack Poland? Would Britain and France honor their guarantees? Would the Soviet Union align with the Western democracies or remain neutral? Could war be avoided? Passengers read newspapers anxiously. The ship's radio officers received continuous news updates. Each bulletin was analyzed for implications. Diplomacy continued, but few believed it would succeed. War seemed not merely possible, but likely. The French line faced a dilemma. Should they continue normal operations or prepare for disruption? Canceling voyages would panic passengers and harm revenue. Continuing operations might leave the ship in a vulnerable position if war began suddenly. The company chose to continue operations while preparing contingency plans. Normandie would sail as scheduled, but could be diverted or recalled if necessary. Crew were briefed on emergency procedures. Lifeboat drills were conducted more frequently. The ship prepared for possibilities that everyone hoped would not occur. Bookings for late August and September were down significantly. Many people postponed travel plans. Those who did book passage were either urgent business travelers or optimists who believed the crisis would pass. The ship sailed less than full for the first time since entering service. Crew morale was strained. Many crew members had families in France. If war came, they would be separated, possibly for years. Communication would be difficult. The crew's personal anxiety added to professional stress. Captain Pugnett remained publicly confident. He assured passengers that the ship was safe, that precautions were adequate, that the voyage would proceed normally. Privately, he consulted with company officials about what to do if war was declared while the ship was at sea. The British and Germans were already taking precautions. British merchant ships were being armed with defensive weapons. German merchant ships were being recalled to home ports. The French line was slower to act, perhaps hoping that maintaining normal operations would demonstrate confidence and help prevent panic. Normandie departed Le Havre on August 23, 1939, on what would be her final commercial voyage. The ship carried fewer than half her normal passenger load. Many who had booked passage cancelled at the last moment. The atmosphere aboard was tense. 2 days into the voyage, news arrived that Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. This development shocked passengers and crew. The possibility of Western democracies and the Soviet Union cooperating against Germany had been an element of the diplomatic balance. That possibility was now eliminated. War was now inevitable. The only questions were when and how. Normandie continued toward New York. Pugnett received instructions to proceed normally, but to prepare for possible diversion to a neutral port if war was declared before arrival. The ship increased speed slightly, hoping to reach New York before the situation deteriorated further. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France issued ultimatums demanding German withdrawal. The ultimatums would expire on September 3rd. If Germany did not comply, Britain and France would declare war. Normandie was in mid-Atlantic when this news arrived. Passengers gathered around radios, listening to broadcasts. Some were frightened, others were resigned. A few seemed almost relieved that uncertainty had ended. The ship reached New York on September 3rd, the same day Britain and France declared war. As Normandie docked at Pier 88, the world was at war. The brief paradise was over. American officials immediately imposed restrictions. Normandie could not depart until her status was clarified. Was she a civilian vessel or a potential military asset? Could she be allowed to return to France, where she might be seized by the French military? Should she remain in New York, in neutral territory? The French line wanted the ship to return home. The French government wanted her available for possible military use, but both recognized that crossing the Atlantic in wartime was dangerous. German submarines were already operating. Normandie, large and slow compared to warships, would be vulnerable. The decision was made. Normandie would remain in New York until the situation clarified. This was intended as temporary. No one imagined the ship would remain in New York for years, but temporary arrangements often become permanent. Passengers disembarked. Most were relieved to be safely ashore. A few expressed regret that they had witnessed the end of an era. They were correct, though they could not know how complete that ending would be. Crew faced difficult decisions. Should they remain with the ship or return to France? Those who remained would be safe, but separated from families. Those who returned would face uncertainty and possible military service. Most chose to remain, at least initially. The ship was moved from the passenger pier to a lay-up berth on the Hudson River. She was tied to the dock with heavy lines, her engines were shut down, and a skeleton crew remained aboard for maintenance and security. Normandie began her transformation from active ship to laid-up vessel. The last peaceful summer had ended. The ship that had symbolized French artistry and technical achievement now sat idle, waiting for a future that no one could predict. Passengers who had crossed aboard her that final summer had experienced something they would never experience again: transatlantic travel as leisure, as luxury, as normalcy. Those passengers told stories about that last voyage for the rest of their lives. They remembered the tension, the uncertainty, the strange contrast between the ship's luxury and the knowledge of approaching war. They remembered conversations with strangers that took on intensity because everyone understood that their world was ending. Some kept menus from that last voyage, or room keys, or postcards purchased in the ship's shops. These artifacts became relics of a lost world. They testified that once, briefly, it had been possible to cross the Atlantic in beauty and safety, surrounded by art and comfort, insulated from the world's conflicts. That possibility was gone. War had come, and with it the end of the old order that had created ships like Normandie. The future would be different, harsher, less confident in progress and civilization. The ship sitting idle at her New York berth was already an anachronism, a beautiful remnant of vanished assumptions. But she was still there, still intact, still capable, theoretically, of resuming service. Perhaps when the war ended, when peace returned, Normandie would sail again. Perhaps the brief paradise could be restored. This hope sustained the crew through the difficult months that followed. They maintained the ship carefully, keeping machinery in working order, protecting the interiors from deterioration, believing that their work would be rewarded when normal life resumed. They could not know that Normandie would never sail again, that her brief paradise had truly ended, that what lay ahead was not restoration but destruction. Normandie sat idle at her New York berth for more than 2 years. During this time, the ship remained French property. The crew maintained her in laying-up condition, performing routine maintenance, managing dehumidification systems to prevent corrosion, protecting furniture and artwork from deterioration. They were caretakers of a magnificent machine that had no purpose. The war in Europe intensified. France fell to Germany in June 1940. The French government fled to Vichy and signed an armistice. This created legal ambiguity about Normandie's status. Was she property of the Vichy government, which collaborated with Germany, or was she property of Free French forces loyal to de Gaulle? The United States was officially neutral until December 1941. During this neutrality period, American authorities allowed Normandie to remain under French flag and French crew, but prevented her from sailing. The ship was trapped by circumstances beyond her control. After Pearl Harbor, American neutrality ended. The United States was now at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan. Normandie's status changed immediately. She was seized under wartime regulations and transferred to U.S. Navy custody. The French crew were removed. American personnel took control. The Navy designated the ship USS Lafayette and began planning her conversion to a troopship. Normandie's luxury accommodations would be stripped out. Her public rooms would be converted to dormitories. She would carry soldiers across the Atlantic, thousands at a time, contributing to the war effort. This conversion work began in December 1941. Navy personnel and civilian contractors swarmed over the ship, tearing out furniture, removing artwork, preparing spaces for new purposes. The work was urgent. Troops needed transport. Every ship mattered. The conversion was hasty and poorly organized. Multiple contractors worked simultaneously without adequate coordination. Safety protocols were inadequate. Workers were under pressure to complete the job quickly, which encouraged cutting corners. Fire watches were irregular. Equipment was left in disarray. On February 9, 1942, workers were using cutting torches in the Grand Salon, removing metal fixtures. A spark ignited a pile of kapok life jackets that had been stored nearby. Kapok is extremely flammable. The life jackets burned intensely, spreading fire to wall coverings, to stored furniture, to wooden structural elements. The fire spread rapidly. Workers attempted to extinguish it, but lacked adequate equipment. Alarm was raised, but communication systems in the partially dismantled ship were not functioning properly. By the time New York City Fire Department arrived, the fire was beyond control. Firefighters poured water into the burning ship. This was standard firefighting procedure, but it was wrong for this situation. Normandie was moored to the pier, unable to maneuver. As thousands of tons of water were pumped into the upper decks, the ship became increasingly unstable. The added weight raised the center of gravity. The ship began to list to port. Engineers recognized the danger. They attempted to counterflood compartments on the starboard side to restore balance, but the counterflooding valves were not accessible. The conversion work had blocked access to systems needed for this emergency. The list continued increasing. By late afternoon, Normandie was listing approximately 20 degrees. Water continued being pumped aboard to fight fires still burning inside. The list reached 30 degrees, then 45 degrees. At 5:30 p.m., approximately 12 hours after the fire began, Normandie capsized at her berth and lay on her port side, in the mud of the Hudson River. One person died during the fire and capsizing, a Navy firefighter. This single death was miraculous given the scale of the disaster. Hundreds of people were aboard when the fire started. The evacuation was successful despite the chaos. But the ship was destroyed, not by fire alone, but by the firefighting response. If less water had been pumped aboard, if counter-flooding had been implemented correctly, Normandie might have remained upright and recoverable. The fire damage was serious, but not necessarily fatal. The capsizing transformed a recoverable situation into catastrophe. A ship lying on its side in river mud could not be easily salvaged. The hull would need to be righted, a massive engineering undertaking. Then it would need to be assessed for damage. Then it might possibly be repaired and returned to service. The investigation that followed identified multiple failures: inadequate fire safety procedures during conversion work, improper storage of flammable materials, insufficient coordination among contractors, lack of clear command structure during the emergency, incorrect firefighting decisions. Blame was widely distributed. The Navy bore responsibility for inadequate oversight of the conversion. Contractors bore responsibility for unsafe work practices. The fire department bore responsibility for pumping excessive water aboard without understanding ship stability principles. Everyone involved had contributed to the disaster. But blame did not restore the ship. Normandie lay on her side, her beautiful interiors destroyed by fire and salt water, her machinery flooded, her future uncertain. The ship that had been built to symbolize French confidence and artistry had been destroyed through American incompetence and haste. The symbolic dimension of the disaster was not lost on observers. France was occupied. French ships should have been valued as symbols of an allied nation's achievement. Instead, Normandie had been carelessly destroyed. This added insult to the injury of occupation. The American government committed to salvaging the ship. This commitment was partly practical, the hull might still be useful, and partly symbolic, demonstrating American capability and compensating for American responsibility. The salvage would be the largest such operation ever attempted. Engineers studied the problem for months. How do you right a 40,000-ton ship lying on its side in mud? Conventional salvage techniques were inadequate. New methods would need to be developed. Equipment would need to be fabricated. The operation would require careful planning and substantial resources. The salvage began in earnest in 1943. Workers removed the ship's superstructure to reduce top weight. They pumped out flooded compartments to increase buoyancy. They attached heavy cables to the port side and connected them to winches on barges alongside. Slowly, incrementally, they began pulling the ship upright. The operation took months. Every step had to be calculated. Pulling too hard could damage the hull. Pulling too little would not overcome the friction holding the ship in the mud. Water had to be managed carefully to maintain stability as the ship rotated. In September 1943, Normandie was finally upright. The hull floated again, though barely. Pumps worked continuously to keep her afloat. The ship was now technically salvaged, but she was a wreck. The interiors were destroyed. The machinery was ruined. Years of work would be needed to make her serviceable. The Navy assessed whether restoration was worthwhile. The conclusion was negative. By late 1943, other troopships were available. The war was progressing. Normandie was obsolete. Restoring her would cost more than building new ships and would take years. The decision was made to scrap the hull. The ship that had been built with such care, decorated with such art, operated with such pride, would be cut apart and melted down. This final indignity was pragmatic but painful. The conversion and catastrophe of Normandie demonstrated how quickly beauty can be destroyed. 4 years of construction, 4 years of operation, 12 hours to burn and capsize. The disproportion between creation and destruction is always shocking, but never more so than when the destruction was preventable. The workers using cutting torches that February morning did not intend to destroy Normandie. The firefighters pumping water aboard were trying to save her. The Navy personnel overseeing the conversion were attempting to serve the war effort. Everyone involved had reasonable intentions. But reasonable intentions are not sufficient. Complex systems require expertise, care, and coordination. Normandie was destroyed because these were lacking. The ship became a victim of the war she had been built, ironically, to serve. We should understand the physics of what happened. A floating ship is stable because its center of gravity is below its center of buoyancy. Imagine a saucer with the pivot point above the saucer board. Any deviation from horizontal causes the pivot point and the board to work together to restore balance. This is positive stability. Normandie, floating normally, had her center of gravity several meters below her center of buoyancy. This gave her excellent stability. The ship could roll in waves and would return to upright. This stability was carefully designed and verified through calculations and model tests. When firefighters pumped thousands of tons of water into the upper decks, they moved weight upward. The center of gravity rose. At some point, the center of gravity rose above the center of buoyancy. At that moment, stability reversed. The ship no longer wanted to return to upright. Any list would be amplified rather than corrected. Engineers call this metacentric height. When metacentric height is positive, the ship is stable. When it becomes negative, the ship is unstable and will capsize. The transition happens at a specific, calculable point. For Normandie, firefighting operations pushed the ship past that point. Counter-flooding could have prevented capsizing. By flooding compartments on the starboard side, weight could have been added low in the hull on the opposite side from the list. This would have lowered the center of gravity and restored stability, but access to the necessary valves was blocked. The designers of Normandie had provided comprehensive damage control systems. They had anticipated flooding from collision or combat damage. They had provided valves, pumps, and piping to manage flooding and maintain stability. These systems were sophisticated and would have worked if accessible. The conversion work had disrupted these systems. Pipes were cut. Valves were blocked by stored materials. Control stations were dismantled. The ship's damage control capability was destroyed by the very people who should have preserved it. As the list increased, objects inside the ship began sliding. Furniture, equipment, materials all moved toward the port side. This movement shifted additional weight, accelerating the list. The process became self-reinforcing. Each degree of list made the next degree more likely. People aboard felt the deck tilting beneath their feet. Walking became difficult, then impossible. Those still inside scrambled toward exits, climbing what had been walls, forcing open doors that now opened upward or downward rather than sideways. The ship's geometry had transformed. Outside observers watched in horror. The massive hull, which had always appeared so stable and permanent, was rotating. The process seemed slow but was inexorable. The port side sank lower. The starboard side rose higher. The funnels tilted toward the water. Then came the moment of capsizing. The ship reached the angle from which she could not recover. She continued rolling, faster now, until she lay completely on her side. The starboard hull, which should have been underwater, was exposed to air. The port side, which should have been visible, was submerged in the river. The sight was disturbing beyond the immediate practical disaster. A ship lying on its side is geometrically wrong. The form is unrecognizable. What should be vertical is horizontal. What should be horizontal is vertical. The mind struggles to comprehend what the eyes see. For the French crew who had maintained the ship through her 2 years of idleness, the capsizing was emotionally devastating. They had cared for Normandie, kept her ready for service, believed they were preserving something valuable. They had failed not through their own fault, but they had failed nonetheless. For French exiles in New York, the capsizing symbolized France's larger catastrophe. France had fallen. French ships were destroyed. French art and culture were endangered. Normandie lying in the mud was a metaphor for the nation's humiliation. American officials were embarrassed. The United States had seized an Allied vessel and destroyed it through incompetence. This did not reflect well on American capability or trustworthiness. Explanations were offered, Investigations were conducted, but the basic fact remained: America had destroyed what France had created. The capsizing attracted enormous media attention. Photographs of the ship lying on her side were published worldwide. She became a symbol of war's waste and destruction. Here was a beautiful thing, created with enormous effort and expense, destroyed carelessly in a single day. Symbolism aside, the capsizing represented a practical loss. The ship's hull contained thousands of tons of steel, copper, brass, and other materials needed for war production. These materials were now locked in a wreck lying in river mud. Salvaging them would be expensive and time-consuming. The capsizing also blocked a valuable berth. Pier 88 and the adjacent water were unavailable for other vessels, while Normandie occupied the space. In wartime, when port capacity was strained, this was significant. The wreck had to be removed not merely for its own sake, but to clear space for ships that could actually contribute to the war effort. The decision to salvage the ship was pragmatic, not sentimental. Military authorities wanted the berth cleared and the materials recovered. They were not concerned with preserving Normandie as a ship. They were concerned with recovering resources and restoring port capacity. But for those who loved the ship, salvage offered hope. If the hull could be raised, perhaps Normandie could be restored. Perhaps after the war, France could reclaim her ship and return her to service. This hope was almost certainly unrealistic, but it sustained people through the salvage process. The 18 months of salvage work were technically fascinating. Engineers developed new techniques for hull rotation, for managing buoyancy, for controlling forces on a damaged hull. These techniques would be used in subsequent salvage operations worldwide. Normandie's capsizing and salvage contributed to marine engineering knowledge even as they destroyed the ship. When the hull was finally upright, the full extent of damage became apparent. The fire had destroyed most internal structure. Saltwater immersion had corroded machinery and electrical systems. The hull itself was structurally weakened by the stresses of capsizing and salvage. Restoration would essentially mean rebuilding the entire ship from the hull up. No one was willing to undertake this effort. The resources required could build multiple new ships. The time required would extend years beyond the war's end. Normandie would be obsolete before restoration could be completed. The economics and logistics were impossible. So the decision was made to scrap the ship. The hull would be cut into pieces, loaded on barges, and transporting to scrapyards. The steel would be melted and reused. Normandie would disappear, transformed from ship to raw material for other purposes. This decision was presented as practical necessity, but it was also a kind of murder, not of a person, but of a creation that embodied human aspiration and achievement. Normandie was not merely steel. She was the physical expression of thousands of people's skill, creativity, and lobke. Destroying her was destroying their work, their vision, their contribution to civilization. The death of the symbol mattered more than the death of the machine. Ships are built to be used and eventually scrapped. This is normal, but Normandie was not a normal ship. She had been built to represent something beyond transportation. She embodied national pride, artistic achievement, technical mastery, cultural values. When she capsized, those values seemed to capsize with her. If France's greatest achievement could be so carelessly destroyed, what did that say about the fragility of civilization? If beauty and craft could not protect themselves against incompetence and haste, what protection did they have? These questions resonated beyond the immediate disaster. The 1930s had seen many confident assumptions destroyed. Economic stability had collapsed in the Depression. Political stability had collapsed with the rise of fascism. International stability had collapsed with the outbreak of war. Normandie's capsizing was one more collapse in a decade of collapses. But there was also something particularly poignant about this specific destruction. Normandie had not been destroyed by enemy action. She had not been torpedoed by a German submarine. She had not been bombed by Luftwaffe aircraft. She had been destroyed by the people who should have been protecting her. This made the disaster harder to accept. If the ship had been lost in combat, her destruction would have had meaning. She would have been a casualty of war, sacrificed in service. Instead, she was a casualty of negligence, destroyed for nothing, teaching no lesson except that incompetence has consequences. The capsizing demonstrated the vulnerability of complex systems. Normandie had been designed with extensive safety features, but those features required knowledge, access, coordination. When the systems were disrupted by conversion work, when the people fighting the fire did not understand ship stability, when communication failed, all the sophisticated engineering was useless. This vulnerability exists in all complex systems. They function beautifully under normal conditions. They fail catastrophically when conditions exceed design parameters or when human operators make mistakes. Normandie's designers could not have anticipated that the ship would be seized, converted, set afire, and improperly fought, all within a few months. The scenario was too improbable. Yet it happened. The improbable became real. The ship capsized. The symbol died. For historians of technology, Normandie's capsizing offers lessons about what we risk when we repurpose sophisticated systems without understanding them. The ship was designed for passenger service. She was being converted for troop transport. The conversion assumed that the hull was simply a container that could be refitted for new purposes. But a ship is not merely a container. It is an integrated system where structure, machinery, and operations are interdependent. Changing one element affects others. The conversion work disrupted these interdependencies without accounting for consequences. The result was catastrophe. The firefighting response suffered from similar misunderstanding. Firefighters knew how to fight building fires. They pumped water onto the fire until it was extinguished. This works for buildings which rest on foundations and cannot capsize. It does not work for ships, which float and have stability limits. The firefighters were not incompetent. They were using appropriate techniques for the wrong situation. They lacked ship-specific knowledge. In the crisis, there was insufficient time to educate them. The ship capsized before proper procedures could be implemented. This points to a fundamental challenge in emergency response. Emergencies are by definition unusual situations. Responders must adapt standard procedures to non-standard circumstances. This requires judgment, knowledge, and often information that is not immediately available. Mistakes are easy to make and difficult to correct. Normandie's capsizing was ultimately a failure of organizational competence. Multiple organizations were involved: Navy, contractors, fire department. No single organization had overall authority. Communication among organizations was poor. Decision-making was fragmented. When the emergency occurred, no one could implement coordinated response. This organizational failure was as responsible for the capsizing as any technical factor. If coordination had been better, if communication had been clearer, if authority had been centralized, proper decisions might have been made in time. The ship might have survived. But organizations are difficult to coordinate, especially in emergencies. People protect their jurisdictions. They follow their training. They do what seems right based on limited information. Achieving true coordination requires advanced planning, clear protocols, and practiced procedures. None of this existed for Normandie's conversion and fire. The operation was improvised, rushed, inadequate. The capsizing was foreseeable but not foreseen. When it happened, it seemed like an accident, but it was really the inevitable result of systemic failures. The death of Normandie as a symbol changed what the ship meant. While intact, she had symbolized achievement and beauty. After capsizing, she symbolized loss and waste. Both meanings were valid. Both were true to different aspects of the ship's history. Perhaps this duality is appropriate. Beauty is always vulnerable. Achievement is always temporary. Nothing human beings create is permanent. We build knowing that what we build will eventually be destroyed. The only questions are how, when, and what meaning the destruction carries. Normandie's destruction carried the meaning of preventable tragedy. The ship did not need to burn. The fire could have been prevented with proper safety procedures. The ship did not need to capsize. The capsizing could have been prevented with proper stability management. None of this was inevitable. Yet it happened. The beautiful thing was destroyed. The symbol died. What remained was wreckage and memory. Raising Normandie required reconceiving the ship as a problem in applied physics. The hull lying on its side in 40 feet of water weighed approximately 40,000 tons. This mass had to be rotated 90 degrees and lifted until it floated. The process had to be controlled carefully to avoid structural failure. The hull had to be righted, not broken. Salvage master Merritt-Chapman and Scott Corporation was contracted to perform the work. They had experience with marine salvage, but nothing approaching this scale. Normandie was the largest ship ever capsized in a harbor. No precedent existed. They would have to develop techniques as they went. The first task was assessment. Divers explored the hull systematically, mapping damage, identifying structural weaknesses, determining which compartments could hold air and which were compromised. This underwater survey took months. Visibility in the Hudson River was poor, currents were strong. The work was cold, dark, and dangerous. The divers discovered that the fire had penetrated deeper into the hull than initially assumed. Many watertight compartments were no longer watertight. Their hatches had been left open during conversion work or had been damaged in the capsizing. This meant the hull's buoyancy was less than it should have been. Restoring watertight integrity was essential. Divers sealed every opening they could reach. They welded steel patches over damaged plating. They closed hatches and secured doors. This work happened underwater, in darkness, by feel as much as by sight. It required enormous patience and skill. Next, the salvage engineers had to remove weight from the upper portions of the hull. The funnels were cut away and lifted out. The superstructure was dismantled section by section. Everything above the main deck was removed. This reduced top weight by several thousand tons and lowered the center of gravity. As weight was removed from above, buoyancy was added below. Divers entered flooded compartments and sealed them from inside. Then pumps forced out the water and replaced it with air. Each compartment made airtight added buoyancy and reduced the weight holding the hull down in the mud. This process was iterative and slow. Pump one compartment, assess the effect, pump another. Sometimes pumping revealed new leaks that had to be sealed. Sometimes the added buoyancy shifted the hull unexpectedly, requiring adjustments. Nothing went exactly as planned. Flexibility and improvisation were essential. The engineers also had to manage the mud. The hull's port side was embedded in river-bottom sediment. This mud gripped the hull with enormous suction. Simply pulling upward would not work. The mud had to be loosened. Water jets were used to erode the mud beneath the hull. High-pressure streams washed away sediment, creating voids under the ship. As the mud loosened, the hull's weight would cause it to settle slightly, but the settling reduced the mud's grip. Gradually, the hull was worked loose from the bottom. While this underwater work proceeded, heavy equipment was positioned on barges alongside the starboard side of the hull. Massive cables were attached to the ship at multiple points. These cables ran to winches on the barges. The winches would pull the ship toward upright as buoyancy was increased and mud was loosened. The actual righting operation began in August 1943. The winches engaged, pulling the cables taut. Initially, nothing visible happened. The forces were enormous, but the hull's inertia was equally enormous. Slowly, measured in millimeters per hour, the ship began to rotate. The process had to be stopped and restarted repeatedly. After each rotation increment, engineers assessed stresses on the hull. They checked for buckling, cracking, or other structural failure. They adjusted cable tensions. They pumped additional compartments. Then they resumed pulling. This caution was necessary. If the hull broke apart during righting, salvage would fail completely. The pieces could not be recovered. Everything would be lost. The operation had to succeed without destroying the hull. As the rotation progressed, the ship became increasingly unstable. When lying flat, the hull rested solidly on the bottom. As it rotated upward, more of its weight was supported by buoyancy rather than the bottom. This made the ship vulnerable to currents, tides, and stress concentrations. Several times, the cables snapped. These failures were dramatic and dangerous. Cables under tremendous tension store enormous energy. When one broke, the ends whipped through the air at lethal speed. Workers learned to stay clear of cable paths. Several were injured despite precautions. Miraculously, no one was killed. By September 1st, 1943, Normandie was nearly upright. The final degrees of rotation were the most difficult. The ship wanted to roll past vertical in the other direction. The winches had to be carefully controlled to bring the hull to exactly upright and hold it there. On September 16th, Normandie floated upright for the first time in 19 months. Pumps were working continuously to remove water that still leaked into the hull. The ship was afloat but barely. She drew more water than designed because many compartments remained flooded. She was a wreck, not a vessel. The salvage was technically successful. The berth was cleared. The hull was recovered. The operation had demonstrated American engineering capability and redeemed the embarrassment of the capsizing. But success was qualified. The cost of salvage exceeded the value of what was recovered. The hull was worth something as scrap, but not as much as salvage cost. The operation made sense only as demonstration project and to clear the berth. Economically, it was a loss. The condition of the ship was worse than hoped. Optimists had imagined that perhaps Normandie could be restored to service after the war. Inspection after writing made clear this was fantasy. The ship was beyond practical restoration. The interiors were destroyed. The machinery was ruined. The hull itself was weakened. What remained was a steel hull, damaged and corroded, with minimal value except as raw material. The salvage had been the second creation of Normandie, but what was created was not a ship. It was a floating wreck, an achievement of engineering that led nowhere. The men who performed the salvage took pride in their work. They had solved an unprecedented problem. They had developed techniques that would be used in future salvage operations. They had demonstrated human capability to master difficult technical challenges. But they were also aware of the tragedy. They were destroying as they salvaged. Every piece of superstructure they cut away was a piece of Normandie lost forever. Every compartment they entered had once been a beautiful room, now filled with sludge and debris. The salvage was archaeology of recent ruin. Divers who explored the interior spaces reported finding artifacts. A chair, somehow still intact, a piece of decorative metalwork, a light fixture. These objects were extracted and preserved by some workers as souvenirs. They are now in museums and private collections, fragments of beauty salvaged from destruction. But most of Normandie's interior was simply destroyed. The art was burned, waterlogged, or corroded. The furniture was rotted or crushed. The machinery was seized and rusted. What could not be saved was lost. The salvage preserved only the steel shell. This reduction of a complex, beautiful ship to mere steel was necessary but melancholic. Normandie had been more than tonnage of metal. She had been an artwork, a technical achievement, a symbol. The salvage could recover the tonnage, but not the meaning. The engineers understood this distinction. They were practical men focused on mechanical problems, but even they felt the loss. Some had seen Normandie in service. They remembered her beauty. Now they were dismantling her. The work was necessary, but it hurt. The salvage also demonstrated the resilience of engineered structures. Despite fire, capsizing, and submersion in saltwater for 19 months, the hull remained structurally intact. The steel frames held. The plating did not collapse. The basic soundness of the original construction was vindicated even in destruction. This resilience was testament to the engineers and workers at Saint-Nazaire who had built the ship. They had built well. Their work survived stresses far beyond design parameters. The ship had been destroyed not by structural failure, but by external circumstances. The construction quality was never in doubt. The second creation of Normandie, the salvage, was an achievement that served no ultimate purpose. The hull was raised only to be scrapped. The effort was expended only to clear a berth and recover materials. No lasting value was created beyond demonstration of technical capability. This futility was characteristic of the war years. Enormous efforts were expended to destroy and then to clear away destruction. Resources that could have built new things were used to undo previous work. The salvage of Normandie was just one small example of this larger waste. Yet the men who did the work did it well. They solved difficult problems, they demonstrated skill and courage, they brought order out of chaos. Their work mattered to them even if its ultimate purpose was limited. This dignity of skilled work persists independent of outcome. When Normandie floated upright in September 1943, no celebration occurred. The ship was still a wreck. The effort had cost millions of dollars and 19 months of intense work. The result was mere clearance of an obstruction. Success was measured in negatives. The berth was no longer blocked. The wreck was no longer a hazard. The second creation had succeeded in its limited goals, but it could not restore what had been lost. The beautiful ship was gone. What remained was an empty hull, soon to be cut apart and melted down. The salvage had been a technical triumph that changed nothing. In October 1946, the hulk of Normandie was sold to Lipset Incorporated for $160,000. This price represented scrap value. The hull contained approximately 45,000 tons of steel, plus smaller amounts of copper, brass, and other metals. At prevailing prices, the materials were worth more than the purchase price, making the deal profitable for the scrap dealer. The hulk was towed from Manhattan to a breaking yard in Port Newark, New Jersey. This short journey was the last time Normandie moved under her own buoyancy. Workers positioned her at the dock, where dismantling would occur, secured her with cables, and began the process of undoing 12 years of history. Dismantling a ship is creation in reverse. What was assembled piece by piece must be disassembled piece by piece. Cutting torches replace welding torches. Materials are removed rather than added. The ship shrinks rather than grows. Workers started at the top and worked downward. First, remaining superstructure was cut away, then upper deck structures, then deck plates, then frames and hull plating. Each piece was cut to manageable size, lifted by crane onto barges, and transporting to the scrapyard where it was melted in furnaces. The work was hot, dangerous, and monotonous. Cutting steel with torches requires standing in showers of sparks, breathing smoke and metal fumes, working in uncomfortable positions. The men who did this work were skilled, but the skill was repetitive. Cut here, cut there, move to the next section, repeat. As the hull was cut apart, features that had been hidden during the ship's life became visible. The internal structure, the frames and stringers and bulkheads, all designed to distribute loads and maintain strength, were exposed. The engineering that had been invisible to passengers was now displayed in section. Observers noted the quality of construction. The steel was thick and uniform. The welding and riveting were sound. The structural design was elegant, using material efficiently without excess. Even in destruction, Normandie demonstrated the skill of those who had built her. Some artifacts were rescued before the hull was completely scrapped. The bronze doors from the first-class entrance were saved and eventually installed in a church. Decorative panels were extracted and sold to collectors. Light fixtures, furniture fragments, artwork that had survived the fire and water were preserved. But most of Normandie simply became scrap. The steel was melted and recast into other products. The identity of the metal was lost. Steel that had crossed the Atlantic in the world's most beautiful ship might have been reused in automobiles, buildings, or other mundane applications. No way to track it, no way to know. This final anonymity was perhaps the saddest aspect of dismantling. While intact, even as a wreck, Normandie remained identifiable. She was herself, a distinct thing with a history and meaning. Once melted, that distinction vanished. The atoms persisted, but the arrangement that made them meaningful was destroyed. The process of dismantling took approximately 2 years. The hull was large and built strongly. Cutting through heavy steel was slow work. The workers moved systematically, section by section, until nothing recognizable remained. Photographs document the progression. Early images show the hull recognizable as a ship, though damaged and incomplete. Later images show only fragments, cut sections that might be from any large steel structure. Final images show empty water where the ship had been. The progression is stark and disturbing. The workers who dismantled Normandie were mostly unaware of the ship's history. To them, this was simply a large salvage job. They cut steel for wages, collected their pay, and went home. The ship's beauty, its brief glory, its symbolic importance, all were irrelevant to the actual work. This indifference was not callousness, it was the normal condition of industrial luck. Most workers are not emotionally invested in what they build or destroy. They perform tasks for compensation. Meaning is a luxury they cannot afford. But some workers did know the ship's history. Older workers remembered when Normandie was new, when her arrival in New York Harbor had been spectacular news. They felt the irony of now cutting her apart. They worked carefully, not from sentiment, but from professional pride, but the sentiment was there. Engineers who studied the dismantling gained insights into 1930s construction techniques. They could see how plates were joined, how frames were oriented, how structure was integrated. This information was valuable for understanding ship design evolution. Normandie's destruction contributed, modestly, to engineering knowledge. The economics of dismantling was straightforward. Lubke costs plus overhead were less than material value. The difference was profit. The calculation was simple and emotionally empty. Beauty, craftsmanship, history, none of these factors affected the mathematics. This reduction of a significant cultural artifact to mere economics is characteristic of capitalism. Markets assign value based on utility and scarcity, not on meaning or history. Normandie's scrap value was determinable. Her cultural value was not. Markets recognized only the former. Critics of capitalism often cite cases like this as evidence of the system's limitations. Value that cannot be quantified is ignored. Profit motive leads to destruction of meaningful things. Alternative systems, they argue, would have preserved Normandie as a cultural resource worth more than scrap. But alternative systems have their own limitations. State ownership did not save Normandie. The ship was seized by the American government and destroyed through government incompetence. Markets did not destroy the ship. War and negligence destroyed it. Markets simply disposed of what remained. The truth is that human institutions, whether capitalist or otherwise, often fail to preserve beautiful things. Preservation requires intentional effort and resources. It requires valuing the past more than immediate utility. This valuation is cultural, not economic, and cultures vary in their willingness to make it. America in the immediate post-war years was not interested in preserving foreign artifacts. The nation was focused on future, on growth, on moving forward. An old French ship represented the past. The past was less important than the future. Scrapping Normandie was logical in that context. France might have preserved the ship if given the opportunity, but France was devastated by the war. The nation lacked resources to repatriate and restore a damaged hulk. French authorities made no serious effort to reclaim Normandie. They had more urgent priorities. So the ship was dismantled. The workers completed their job. The scrap dealer made his profit. The berth was cleared. Everything was efficient and orderly. The only loss was meaning. Undoing creation is always faster than creation itself. Saint-Nazaire workers spent 4 years building Normandie. Newark workers spent 2 years dismantling her. The asymmetry is characteristic. Destruction is easier than construction. Entropy increases. But the asymmetry has another dimension. The workers at Saint-Nazaire were building something unprecedented. They had to solve problems, develop techniques, create something new. The workers at Newark were performing routine tasks. They cut steel, an operation they had done countless times. Creation requires creativity. Destruction requires only persistence. This makes destruction less valuable, even if the immediate results are similar. Both operations reduced the ship to raw material, either adding steel to the hull or removing it, but only one operation was creative. The final section of Normandie was cut away and removed in October 1948. The site where the ship had been was now empty water. No physical trace remained. The greatest French ship ever built had been erased from physical existence. But it had not been erased from memory. People who had sailed aboard her, worked on her, or simply seen her remembered. They carried those memories for the rest of their lives. They told stories. They showed photographs. They kept the ship alive in ways that steel could not be kept alive. This tension between material destruction and persistent memory is central to how we relate to lost things. What is physically destroyed can remain meaningful through recollection and testimony. Normandie was gone, but Normandie was also still present in human consciousness. The dismantling marked the end of the ship's physical existence, but it was not the end of the ship's influence or significance. That would persist, would evolve, would continue affecting how people thought about ships, about beauty, about loss. Undoing creation is not the same as erasing significance. The workers at Newark could cut apart the steel, but they could not cut apart what the steel had meant. That was beyond their tools, beyond their task, beyond their power. When a ship is destroyed, fragments remain. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York acquired decorative panels from Normandie's Grand Salon. These panels, created by Jean Duppers, now hang in the museum's decorative arts galleries. Museum visitors see them without necessarily knowing their origin. The panels are beautiful autonomous objects, but they were designed as integral elements of a larger whole. This decontextualization is inevitable when artifacts survive their original settings. A panel that once complemented other panels, contributed to a room's total aesthetic, functioned within a specific spatial and social context, now exists alone. Its meaning has changed. It is no longer part of a ship. It is a museum piece. Other fragments ended up in private collections. Furniture, light fixtures, metalwork, all were salvaged and sold. Some collectors knew exactly what they were acquiring. Others simply bought attractive objects without understanding their provenance. These artifacts scattered across America and Europe. Normandie's bronze entrance doors were installed in Our Lady of Lebanon Maronite Cathedral in Brooklyn. They served their original function, providing entrance, but in a completely different context. Church visitors pass through doors designed for an ocean liner. The incongruity is invisible to most. The doors are simply doors. This functional continuation is perhaps the most successful form of survival. Objects that continue serving their purpose retain a kind of life, even divorced from original context. They were made to be used, and they are still used. This matters more than preservation behind glass. Photographs preserve Normandie more completely than any physical artifact. Thousands of photographs documented the ship's construction, operation, destruction, and dismantling. These images allow us to see what no longer exists. They are evidence of what was. But photographs are selective. They show what photographers chose to photograph. Normandie's grand public spaces were extensively photographed. Crew quarters were rarely photographed. We have abundant images of first-class luxury, sparse images of third-class simplicity, almost no images of machinery spaces or working areas. This selectivity shapes memory. We remember what was documented. Undocumented aspects fade. The ship we remember through photographs is not fully the ship that existed. It is the ship that was considered worth photographing, which reflects 1930s values and priorities. Film footage exists but is limited. A few minutes of footage show Normandie entering New York Harbor, passengers on deck, public rooms. This footage is precious because it shows motion, the ship alive. Still photographs show beauty, film shows life. But even film is selective and constructed. Cameras were positioned to show the ship at flattering angles. Scenes were staged for effect. What appears spontaneous was often arranged. We are seeing a version of Normandie intended for public presentation, not the total reality of shipboard life. Written accounts provide different evidence. Passenger letters, crew journals, official reports, newspaper articles all describe aspects of the ship and life aboard. These texts are valuable because they record subjective experience, what it felt like to be aboard, not just what the ship looked like. But written accounts are unreliable in their own ways. Memory is fallible. Authors have biases. Descriptions reflect limited perspectives. No single account captures the whole truth. We must read many accounts, compare them, synthesize understanding from fragments. Engineering drawings survive in archives. These documents show how Normandy was designed and built. They are technically precise, but emotionally empty. They describe structure and systems, but convey nothing of beauty or meaning. The ship they document is purely functional. This multiplicity of evidence, physical and documentary, allows reconstruction of knowledge about Normandy. But reconstruction is not recovery. We can know about the ship without having access to the actual experience of the ship. Knowledge is not presence. Consider what is lost completely: the smell of the ship, the specific sounds of her operation, the exact quality of light in various spaces, the subtle motions of a ship this size in different sea conditions. These sensory experiences were never adequately recorded. They are gone. Also gone is the social world that existed aboard. The specific conversations, relationships, dramas, and mundane interactions that occurred during hundreds of voyages. A few stories survive, but most human experience aboard Normandie left no trace. It happened and was forgotten. This erasure is normal. Most human experience leaves no record. We remember exceptional moments. The routine, the ordinary, the unremarkable daily experience that constituted most of life aboard Normandie has vanished. What survives is the unusual, the spectacular, the photographed. Yet even incomplete memory is valuable. The fragments that survive allow us to know that Normandie existed, what she looked like, how she functioned. This is more than nothing. It is enough to establish historical fact and sustain cultural memory. Museums, archives, and collectors have deliberately preserved some materials, but much was preserved accidentally because someone happened to keep a photograph, or because an object was stored in an attic and forgotten until discovered decades later. Survival is often random. Normandy artifacts occasionally appear at auction: a menu, a postcard, a piece of china. These objects command high prices from collectors who value them as tangible connections to the ship. The market for Normandy memorabilia demonstrates continuing interest decades after the ship's destruction. This commercial interest is ambiguous. It preserves materials by making them valuable, but it also reduces them to commodities. An artifact's meaning becomes secondary to its market value. Collectors own history as they own any other property. Some artifacts were preserved by institutions with educational missions. The Musée National de la Marine in Paris holds Normandy materials. These are accessible to researchers and displayed to educate the public. This kind of preservation serves broader purposes than private collection. Digital archives now preserve photographs and documents that were previously accessible only to specialists. These online resources democratize access to Normandie's history. Anyone with internet access can see images of the ship, read contemporary accounts, study engineering drawings. This digital preservation has limitations. A photograph on a screen is not the same as a physical print. The resolution is different. The tactile quality is absent. Something is lost in digital reproduction, but something is also gained: accessibility, preservation from physical deterioration, ability to share widely. The survivors who sailed aboard Normandie are now all dead. The last passenger, who crossed on the ship's maiden voyage in 1935, would have been born around 1910 at the latest, and would have needed to reach at least 115 years to still be alive in 2025. That is statistically improbable. Direct memory has ended. This transition from living memory to historical memory changes how we relate to the past. While survivors lived, we could ask them questions, hear their direct testimony, access personal recollection. Now we depend entirely on recorded evidence. The past has become fixed in ways it was not, while survivors could still revise our understanding through their testimony. What survived Normandie's destruction is enough to establish historical record, but not enough to fully recreate experience. We can know facts, we can see images, we can read descriptions, but we cannot board the ship, walk her decks, experience her as she was. That is gone forever. This permanent loss is melancholic, but it is also universal. Everything passes, every beautiful thing is destroyed, every moment becomes memory and then disappears when memory fades. Normandie's fate is every artifact's fate, merely accelerated. What survived survives imperfectly, fragmentarily, ambiguously, but it survives. And that survival allows us to contemplate what was created, what was lost, what it means when human beings build beautiful things that cannot last. Why does the loss of Normandie still matter 90 years later? The ship was one vessel among thousands destroyed in mid-20th century conflicts. Millions of people died. Entire cities were bombed to rubble. Ancient artifacts were destroyed. In this context, the loss of a luxury liner seems relatively minor. Yet Normandie retains significance beyond her physical importance. The ship represents something about human aspiration and its limits. She embodies the tension between creation and destruction that defines modern existence. Consider what Normandie represented when built. She was a statement of confidence in progress, belief that human beings could create ever more sophisticated and beautiful things. She was optimistic, forward-looking, celebrating modernity while honoring craft tradition. This optimism was challenged almost immediately. The ship entered service just as Europe approached war. Her brief period of operation coincided with the final collapse of the interwar order. She was rendered obsolete not by technical limitations, but by political catastrophe. The contrast between what Normandie was supposed to represent and what actually happened is instructive. Human beings can create magnificence, but creation exists within historical circumstances that creators cannot control. Beauty does not protect itself. Achievement does not guarantee its own continuation. This is a difficult lesson. We want to believe that quality endures, that excellence persists, but history suggests otherwise. Quality and excellence are vulnerable. They depend on conditions that may not continue. When conditions change, beauty is destroyed as readily as ugliness. Normandie's destruction was not inevitable. Different decisions at multiple points could have preserved the ship. Better fire safety during conversion, correct stability management during firefighting, greater commitment to preservation after salvage. The ship could have survived. But she did not survive. This fact matters. It demonstrates that preservation requires active effort and resources. The default is decay and loss. Survival is the exception, the result of deliberate choice sustained over time. Modern society is uncomfortable with this reality. We believe in preservation, in heritage conservation, in protecting what matters. We have UNESCO World Heritage Sites, preservation laws, cultural protection regimes. We act as though significance guarantees protection. But these protections are recent and fragile. For most of human history, nothing was preserved except what people actively chose to maintain. And even active maintenance could not prevent destruction by war, natural disaster, or changing priorities. Loss was normal. Normandie's story reminds us that the default setting is loss. If we want to preserve things, we must work against entropy, against decay, against the forces that destroy. This work is never finished. It must be sustained generation after generation. There is also a question about what should be preserved. Should Normandie have been preserved? The ship was expensive to maintain, served no practical purpose after the war, and represented a social order many found objectionable. Perhaps resources spent preserving her could have been better used. This utilitarian argument has merit, but it misses something important. Beauty has value beyond utility. Art matters independently of practical function. If we preserve only what is useful, we impoverish ourselves. We lose contact with aspects of human experience that transcend immediate needs. Normandie was not merely functional. She was art, craft, aspiration embodied in steel and decoration. She represented human capacity to create beyond necessity, to make things beautiful as well as useful. This capacity distinguishes human cultures from animal survival. When we destroy beautiful things, we damage ourselves. Not immediately, not practically, but spiritually and culturally. We lose examples of what is possible. We lose inspiration. We lose connection with previous generations who valued different things than we value. Normandie's loss is one loss among countless others in the 20th century, but each loss diminishes the total heritage available to subsequent generations. We inherit less than our ancestors inherited. Future generations will inherit less than we possess. The direction is toward poverty, not richness. This gradual impoverishment is rarely noticed because it happens slowly and because we adapt to what we have. People who never saw Normandie do not miss her. They cannot miss what they never knew. Loss becomes invisible over time. But the cumulative effect of many such losses is cultural thinning. We have fewer examples of excellence to study and emulate. Our references narrow, our imagination contracts. We lose capacity to conceive alternatives to present reality. Perhaps this is acceptable. Perhaps modern society should look forward, not backward. Perhaps preservation is nostalgia, an obstacle to progress. Perhaps destroying the past liberates the future. These arguments are made frequently. They reflect modernist and progressive ideologies that dominated much of the 20th century, but they are less persuasive now. We have learned that destroying the past does not necessarily improve the future. Sometimes it simply impoverishes both. Normandie could have become a museum, like Queen Mary in Long Beach, California. She could have educated millions of people about 1930s design, marine engineering, transatlantic travel history. She could have been economically self-sustaining through tourism. Preservation was possible. It did not happen because no one with sufficient resources and authority chose to make it happen. This was failure of vision and will, not impossibility. The ship could have survived. She did not because people did not value preservation enough to pay its costs. This suggests that what we preserve reflects what we value. America chose not to preserve Normandie because Americans did not value her enough. This was a choice, conscious or unconscious. It reveals priorities, present needs over past achievements, utility over beauty, forward motion over reflection. Different priorities might have produced different outcomes. A society that valued cultural heritage more highly, that saw preservation as important rather than optional, might have saved the ship. This is not judgment. It is observation about how values shape actions. The philosophical aftermath of Normandie's loss includes recognition that beauty is hostage to circumstances. The ship was created in one political and economic context. She was destroyed in another. The creation context valued beauty. The destruction context valued utility and efficiency. When contexts change, values change, and what was precious becomes disposable. This contextual vulnerability of beauty is troubling. It suggests that no achievement is secure. Everything depends on continuing conditions that may not continue. This is true, but it is not an argument for nihilism. It is an argument for humility. We create knowing that what we create will not last forever. This knowledge should inform creation without paralyzing it. We build for our time, knowing that future times may not value what we value. This is acceptable. It is the human condition. Normandie's builders did not know the ship would be destroyed within a decade. Had they known, would they have built differently? Probably not. They built the best ship they could build, given their knowledge, resources, and values. The ship's brief life does not invalidate the achievement. This suggests a different way of thinking about preservation and loss. What matters is not only whether things survive, but that they existed at all. Normandie was real. She sailed. She carried passengers. She demonstrated what was possible. That historical fact persists even though the physical ship does not. Memory preserves what matter cannot preserve. This is not equivalent to physical preservation, but it is something. It allows knowledge to persist. It permits inspiration across time. It maintains connection between past and present. The philosophical questions raised by Normandie's loss are ultimately questions about meaning. Does beauty have intrinsic value or only instrumental value? Do we create for eternity or for our moment? What obligations do we have to preserve what previous generations created? These questions lack definitive answers. Different philosophical traditions answer differently, but the questions themselves are important. They force us to examine our values and priorities. They make explicit what is usually implicit. Normandie's loss also raises questions about fate and contingency. If the fire had not started, if the firefighting had been correct, if post-salvage preservation had been pursued, the ship might still exist. Each of these ifs was contingent. Different choices would have produced different outcomes. But the choices were not made. History took the path it took. This raises the question, was Normandie's destruction determined, or was it merely contingent? If we could rewind history and replay it, would the ship always be destroyed, or might she sometimes survive? This is a question about determinism versus chance in historical causation. It is unanswerable empirically, but it matters philosophically. If outcomes are determined, human choice is illusory. If outcomes are contingent, choice matters and history could have been different. The evidence suggests contingency. Each decision that led to Normandie's destruction could have been made differently. The fire was not inevitable. The capsizing was not inevitable. The scrapping was not inevitable. Different circumstances would have produced different results. This contingency is both hopeful and disturbing. Hopeful because it suggests human agency matters. Choices have consequences. We can shape outcomes. Disturbing because it means that valuable things can be lost through mistakes, accidents, and poor judgment. If Normandie's destruction was contingent, then responsibility can be assigned. People made choices that destroyed the ship. These choices were wrong. They should have been made differently. This is not merely retrospective judgment. It is ethical assessment. But assigning responsibility is complicated. Many people contributed to the outcome. Some acted with negligence. Others acted reasonably given limited information. Still, others inherited situations not of their making. Where does responsibility actually lie? Perhaps responsibility is distributed across the entire chain of events. The workers who stored flammable materials carelessly, the supervisors who failed to enforce safety procedures, the firefighters who pumped excessive water, the officials who decided against preservation. Everyone contributed. This distributed responsibility is characteristic of complex organizational failures. No single person destroys a ship. Systems fail. Organizations make sequential mistakes. The outcome is collective, even if individual choices seem minor. Understanding this complexity is important. It prevents simplistic blame assignment, but it should not absolve anyone. Distributed responsibility is still responsibility. Those who contribute to destructive outcomes remain responsible for their contributions. The philosophical aftermath of Normandie's loss includes questions about learning. Did the disaster teach lessons that prevented similar losses? Have subsequent generations learned from the mistakes that destroyed the ship? The evidence is mixed. Some lessons were learned. Fire safety during ship conversions improved after Normandie. Stability management during emergencies received more attention. Salvage techniques advanced. These are concrete improvements. But broader lessons seem not to have been learned. Beautiful things continue to be destroyed through negligence. Cultural heritage continues to be undervalued. Present needs continue to overwhelm preservation. The pattern repeats. This suggests that learning is difficult. Organizations and societies have short memories. People who experienced Normandie's loss are dead. Their knowledge died with them. Each generation must learn again what previous generations learned. Perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps each generation must make its own mistakes. Perhaps wisdom cannot be transmitted through testimony and text. Perhaps experience is the only teacher. If this is true, then loss is unavoidable. Each generation will destroy some of what previous generations created. This destruction is the price of change and renewal. We cannot preserve everything. We must accept that much will be lost. But accepting inevitable loss is different from accepting preventable loss. Normandie's destruction was preventable. Better choices would have preserved the ship. This was not inevitable loss. It was failure. The distinction matters. We can reduce preventable loss through better practices, stronger institutions, clearer values. We cannot eliminate all loss, but we can minimize unnecessary loss. This is worth pursuing. The philosophical aftermath of Normandie includes recognition that beauty is vulnerable but not meaningless. The ship was destroyed, but the fact that she existed matters. She demonstrated possibilities. She raised standards. She inspired people. These effects persist. When we contemplate Normandie's loss, we are not merely mourning a ship. We are reflecting on human capacity to create and destroy, on the vulnerability of beauty, on the relationship between past and present, on questions of value and meaning that transcend any particular artifact. These reflections are the true aftermath. Normandie is gone, but the questions she raises remain. How should we relate to the past? What should we preserve? How do we balance present needs against historical continuity? These questions face every society in every generation. Normandie does not answer these questions, but she makes them visible. She provides a concrete case that illustrates abstract issues. This is perhaps her most important legacy, not the ship itself, but the thinking her loss provokes. There is a pier in Manhattan where Normandie once docked. The pier has been rebuilt multiple times since 1942. It no longer looks as it did when the French line used it. Modern cruise terminals have replaced the old passenger facilities, but the location persists. The geography is unchanged. If you stand there now, you can imagine where the ship stood. You can visualize her bow extending out, her stern back toward shore. You can picture passengers climbing the gangway, stevedores loading luggage, tugs maneuvering the great hull into position. But this is imagination, not memory. No one living today saw Normandie at this pier. The experience is entirely second-hand, mediated through photographs and descriptions. The ghost we imagine is constructed from fragments of evidence, not from direct encounter. This is the nature of historical consciousness. We know about things we did not experience. We form mental images of past realities. We stand in locations that once meant something different. We bridge time through imagination informed by research. The gap between past and present is absolute. We cannot travel backward. We cannot see Normandie as she was. We cannot board her, walk her decks, experience what passengers experienced. That is lost. All we can do is imagine based on what survived. But imagination informed by evidence is not fiction. It is historical understanding. It is different from direct experience, but not invalid. It allows us to have relationship with the past, to learn from it, to be shaped by it. Standing at Pier 88 in 2025, we can know that Normandie was here. We can know what she looked like, how she functioned, what she meant. We can understand her significance even though we cannot see her. Knowledge bridges the gap that experience cannot cross. The ghost at Pier 88 is what remains when a significant thing is destroyed but not forgotten. The ship is absent, but the ship is also present through memory, through artifacts, through the continuing impact of her brief existence. This ghostly persistence is characteristic of how we relate to lost things that mattered. They haunt us, not literally, not supernaturally, but culturally and psychologically. They remain in consciousness even when absent from the world. Why does Normandie haunt us? Why does this particular ship, among thousands destroyed, retain significance? Partly because she was so beautiful. Beauty is memorable. We retain images of beautiful things more readily than images of ordinary things. Normandie's extraordinary beauty makes her memorable. Partly because her destruction was so dramatic. Fire, capsizing, salvage, scrapping, the sequence was spectacular. Drama enhances memory. We remember stories with dramatic arcs. partly because she represents loss that seems paradigmatic. The ship embodied certain values: beauty, craftsmanship, cultural confidence, international connection. Her destruction represents the larger destruction of the world that created her. This symbolic dimension elevates Normandie above mere factual history. The ship becomes metaphor. She stands for the fragility of civilization, the vulnerability of beauty, the impermanence of human achievement. This metaphoric significance is why we remember her. But we should not lose sight of the specific. Normandie was not only metaphor. She was an actual ship, built by actual people, operated by actual crews, experienced by actual passengers. The specific reality matters as much as the symbolic meaning. When we remember Normandie, we remember both dimensions. We remember the beautiful ship that crossed the Atlantic in the late 1930s, and we remember what that ship represented about human possibility and limitation. The ghost at Pier 88 is a reminder that the past is not entirely past. What happened continues to matter. History shapes present understanding. We are connected to previous generations through the things they created and the meanings those things carry. Standing at that pier, looking at water where a great ship once floated, we can ask the questions that matter. Why do we build beautiful things? What happens when they are destroyed? What do we learn from what remains after beauty is gone? These questions have no simple answers. They require us to think about values, about priorities, about what kind of world we want to inhabit. They force us to examine our relationship with the past and our responsibilities to the future. Normandie cannot answer these questions. The ship is gone, but her absence is eloquent. It teaches through loss what presence might not teach. It demonstrates that beauty is precious precisely because it is vulnerable, that achievement matters precisely because it is difficult, that the past is significant precisely because it is irretrievable. The ghost at Pier 88 is not frightening, it is melancholic. It represents not threat but loss, not danger but absence. It reminds us of what was and is no longer. But the ghost is also inspiring. Normandie existed. Human beings created her. Against economic depression, political uncertainty, and approaching catastrophe, they built something magnificent. They demonstrated that beauty is possible even in difficult times, perhaps especially in difficult times. This demonstration persists. The ship is destroyed, but the fact of her creation remains. We can still know that such beauty was made. We can still be inspired by the achievement. We can still aspire to similar excellence in our own work. The ghost at Pier 88 asks us what we will create, what we will build, what legacy we will leave. These are not abstract questions. They are invitations to action, to creation, to meaningful work. Normandie's legacy is not merely the fragments that survived. It is the continuing challenge to create beautifully, to build well, to aspire to excellence. This challenge faces each generation. It faced the people of Saint Nazaire in the 1930s. It faces us now. We cannot rebuild Normandie. That specific beauty is lost, but we can build other beautiful things. We can honor craft and artistry. We can refuse to accept that utility alone is sufficient. We can insist that how things look and feel matters as much as what they do. This is the practical legacy, not nostalgia for a vanished ship, but commitment to the values that created her, not mourning the past, but applying its lessons to the present. The ghost at Pier 88 is finally a question, a gentle, persistent question that each visitor must answer individually. The ship was here, she was beautiful, she was destroyed. What does this mean? What does it mean for how we live, what we value, what we preserve, what we create? Each person will answer differently, but the question itself is valuable. It forces reflection. It creates space for thinking about things that matter beyond immediate necessity. It connects us with people long dead who shared similar concerns. Normandie is gone, but something remains, not steel or decoration, something less tangible and more durable. The memory of beauty, the knowledge that such things are possible, the inspiration to attempt similar achievement, the question of what we will do with our own brief time. The water at Pier 88 is empty, but the emptiness is full of meaning. The absence speaks, the ghost persists. What do we learn from what remains after beauty is gone? We learn that beauty was real, that human hands created it, that it mattered to people who are now dead, that it matters still to us who never saw it, that creation and destruction are both part of the human story, that nothing lasts, but that makes what briefly existed more precious, not less. We learn that the work of building beautiful things is worth doing even knowing they will not last forever, that the value is in the making as much as in the made, that generations unborn will judge us partly by what we created and partly by what we preserved. We learn to be humble about our own creations. They too will pass, they too will become ghosts, they too will be remembered or forgotten based on factors we cannot control. We learn that loss is inevitable but not meaningless, that what is destroyed still teaches, that absence can be eloquent, that ghosts have wisdom. This is what remains after beauty is gone, not the beauty itself, but the knowledge that it existed, not the thing, but the meaning of the thing, not presence, but the absence that makes presence retroactively significant. The ghost at Pier 88 waits, patient, silent, present in absence, teaching through loss, asking its question to each visitor, receiving answers or silence, persisting regardless. Normandie is gone, the ghost remains, the question endures. What do we learn from what remains after beauty is gone?